It was just past midnight in early November. The city swaddled in the muted hush that often follows the brief lull between the bustle of Halloween and the heavier chill of approaching winter. The streets outside my post on the 14th floor of an aging office building in Midtown were slick from a persistent drizzle, the kind that leaves faint, oily reflections in puddles under flickering sodium lights. The air carried the scent of wet asphalt and exhaust, overlaid with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of decayed leaves swept along the gutter by the wind. The building itself, constructed in the 1920s, had the characteristic odor of old concrete, aged wood, and decades of dust that had settled in unnoticed corners, punctuated occasionally by the faint whiff of mold behind a vent. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, key ring jangling softly as I moved from floor to floor. The hum of the city was a distant heartbeat now, replaced by the creaking of old floorboards and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere above. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, giving the hallways a staccato rhythm that made the shadows stretch and shrink in unpredictable ways. I paused at each doorway, listening, noting the small details. The scuff marks on the carpet, the faint outline of a chair pressed against a wall, the way the air seemed to grow cooler near the elevators. Instinct had trained me to notice these minutiae because in a building this old, any anomaly could mean a safety hazard or something more. On the 12th floor, I passed the office spaces that were largely abandoned now. Most companies had moved out long ago, leaving behind the skeleton of cubicles, yellowing paperwork, and half-broken furniture. A faint breeze, unnatural for a sealed building, whispered through a cracked window near the stairwell. I followed the sound, crouching slightly as I examined the wall near the maintenance closet. There was a subtle irregularity in the molding, a section that didn't quite line up. I hesitated, a mix of curiosity and caution tightening my chest. My hands, gloved against the chill, traced the edge of the panel. The wood felt cooler than the surrounding wall, unnaturally smooth in contrast to the rough grain elsewhere. It took several moments before I found the latch, hidden behind a faintly painted-over keyhole. With a soft click, the panel shifted, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The smell that came wafting up was unlike the must of the rest of the building. It was earthy, damp, and slightly metallic, like the air just after a rainstorm in a forest. I considered my options. Standard procedure for security was to report anomalies immediately, but the building had been mostly abandoned, and this stairwell had clearly been long neglected. My instincts told me to proceed slowly, to let my senses guide me. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and stepped down. Each footfall echoed faintly, the sound absorbed strangely by the damp air and concrete walls. The stairs were narrow, the railing rusted under my touch. I could hear the faint, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere below, and I imagined the possibility of small animals having made this hidden space their home. I reminded myself of the basics. Stay aware of your surroundings, maintain an exit route, and trust your instincts. My heartbeat was steady, but alert, every small sound amplified by the silence surrounding me. The bottom. The stairwell opened into a room that had clearly not seen human attention for decades. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight like tiny fireflies. The floor was littered with broken furniture and yellowed newspapers, each with headlines that seemed impossibly old. The air smelled of damp concrete and iron, mixed with the faint hint of decay. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile debris. My hand brushed against a wall, and I noted the sensation of peeling paint under my fingertips, rough in some areas, smooth where water had worn it down. There were signs of habitation, though not recent. Small nests of paper and fabric in the corners suggested rats or mice, their faint scent mingling with the underlying must. I paused, listening. There was a scuttling sound, muted and cautious, and I froze. My mind catalogued the possibilities. Animals, an intruder, or simply the building settling in its old bones. The scuttling receded, leaving only the dripping and the occasional sigh of air through cracks. I took a step forward, then another, careful to maintain a sense of presence without provoking whatever might lurk in the shadows. The room extended deeper than I expected, and I began noticing details that suggested it had once been used as a storage area or possibly a small office. Filing cabinets, though rusted shut, lined one wall. The drawers had labels in typeface that hadn't been common for decades. One cabinet had a door ajar, revealing stacks of paper bound with brittle string. The handwriting on some of the notes was meticulous, almost obsessive in its neatness. I crouched to examine one closer. It appeared to be logs, records of transactions, meetings, and employee shifts, some marked with initials I didn't recognize. The further I explored, the stronger the sense grew that I had stumbled into a private archive long forgotten. As I moved toward the back of the room, I noticed a second door, partially obscured by a fallen bookshelf. Unlike the panel I had found on the 12th floor, this door was solid, wooden, and reinforced with a metal handle that had oxidized to a dull green. My curiosity warred with caution. I placed my hand on the handle and felt the vibration of the building, subtle but perceptible, as if the walls themselves were alive in their slumber. I could hear the city faintly above, a distant hum like the echo of a giant engine. I considered retreating, but some part of me, the part trained to observe, to catalog, to discover, urged me forward. I turned the handle slowly. The door gave way with a reluctant creak, revealing a space that defied my expectations. It was small, barely large enough for a person to sit comfortably, and lined with shelves, each filled with objects carefully placed. Journals, jars of unknown substances, small mechanical devices whose purpose I could not immediately discern. The smell here was different still, a blend of oil, metal, and aged paper. I ran my gloved fingers over a journal, feeling the texture of the leather and the raised lettering on the spine. Inside, the handwriting was precise, almost artistic, chronicling experiments, observations, and notes on building maintenance and human behavior within the structure. I stepped inside fully, the flashlight sweeping over the shelves. My mind cataloged the objects. A brass compass, a collection of keys, small tools, and mechanical components that suggested someone had been working here meticulously and secretly. I paused, taking in the atmosphere, the faint echo of my breathing, the subtle vibration of the building, and the lingering sense of presence, as if the space had been waiting for someone to rediscover it. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the subtle patterns, the careful arrangements that suggested a methodical mind. There was an order here that contrasted with the chaos of the rest of the abandoned floors. I crouched to inspect a small device on a lower shelf. It appeared to be some kind of timer, its hands frozen mid-cycle. I wondered about the person who had left this behind, what they had been documenting, and why it had been hidden so thoroughly. My instincts told me to photograph everything for later analysis, but I restrained myself, knowing that every action in a place like this mattered. I paused at the back of the room, feeling a chill run through my spine despite the relatively mild November night outside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a physiological response that I had learned to trust. I scanned the room, noting exits, potential hazards, and the layout. I realized that the hidden room was not simply a curiosity. It was a sanctuary, a carefully constructed space for observation and recording, forgotten but preserved. My thoughts drifted to the people who might have moved through this building over the decades, unaware of the secret beneath their feet. Hours passed, though the world outside remained unchanged, and I became aware of the tactile sensations of my environment. The cold, slightly damp floor under my knees, the grain of the wood shelves under my fingertips, the smooth glass of jars that had survived decades of neglect. The room's silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the building, the distant drip of water, and the faint scurrying of small animals beyond my flashlight's reach. I felt a profound connection to the space, a sense of witnessing history in its most intimate form. Eventually, I decided to leave, retracing my steps carefully. I made mental notes of landmarks: the ajar filing cabinet, the fallen bookshelf, the hidden stairwell panel. I exited slowly, listening, breathing deliberately, and ensuring that every movement was deliberate. As I ascended the narrow stairs back to the 12th floor, I reflected on the lessons of observation, patience, and humility. The city above, with its flashing lights and distant sirens, felt both familiar and strange, as though I had been in a parallel world beneath it. Back on my regular rounds, the building seemed different. I walked the hallways with renewed awareness, noting details I had previously ignored: the way the floorboards shifted, the way the air smelled near vents, the faint echoes of footsteps that might not belong to me. I understood that discovery carries responsibility, to observe without disturbance, to respect the unknown, and to carry the memory of hidden spaces carefully. By the time my shift ended and the first gray light of dawn crept over the skyline, I had cataloged every detail I could remember, mentally preparing a report that could only hint at the truth. The hidden room, with its meticulous organization, its silent testimony, and its careful preservation, had taught me that the city holds secrets not only in its history books but in the quiet, overlooked corners of its buildings. That night, I realized that vigilance is not merely about security. It is about noticing, understanding, and respecting the worlds that exist just beyond the surface of the everyday. And as I locked the front doors and stepped into the crisp morning air, the memory of the hidden room lingered like a quiet pulse beneath my skin, a reminder that even in a city of millions, there are places untouched, waiting, and infinitely patient. The city had not changed, but I had, carrying with me the calm, suspenseful awareness that every building, every floor, every shadow has a story, and some stories wait decades for someone willing to see them. This experience stayed with me for weeks, informing not only how I conducted my rounds but also how I approached life. Observation, patience, and trust in one's instincts proved invaluable, whether in the quiet of a hidden room or the clamor of city streets. I learned that discovery often requires moving slowly, listening carefully, and respecting both the seen and the unseen. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that sometimes the most profound encounters are those that do not announce themselves, that exist in silence, and that reward only those willing to look closely enough. The evening began the way many evenings in Atlanta begin, with traffic crawling in long red rivers across the downtown connector. It was late autumn, the air still holding on to a faint memory of warmth from the day but already dipping toward a sharp chill. The sky was a muted gray, dusk pressing at its edges, and streetlights blinked awake one by one as though they, too, felt the need to shake off sleep. I had been driving since early afternoon, weaving through neighborhoods with names I knew like childhood songs, and though the city pulsed in its usual restless way, I felt a stillness inside myself. That stillness would not last. I pulled the cab over near a midtown curb where a man stood waiting. He wasn't dressed in the kind of clothes I normally saw around that area. A plain gray coat, loose at the shoulders, a collar pulled high enough to shadow half his face. His shoes looked new but strangely out of step with the season, light fabric where most wore leather or boots this time of year. He carried nothing, no bag, no phone in his hand, no air of rushing to dinner or a meeting. When he slid into the back seat, he gave me an address, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Out by Stone Mountain, past the tourist trail." That caught my attention. I had driven plenty of passengers out to Stone Mountain Park before. Families with picnic baskets, tourists eager to see the giant carving, hikers ready for the climb. But this man's tone was different. He wasn't asking for the summit or the main gate. He wanted something beyond, something quiet. I tapped the address into my meter and pulled back into traffic. The rain started as a mist, brushing faint streaks across the windshield. The wipers squeaked, rhythmic and steady, as we threaded out of the city. I glanced into the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his face. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe mid-30s. His eyes stayed fixed on the blur of lights outside the window. There was a kind of gravity about him, like he was holding words back, weighing whether or not to speak. We rode in silence for nearly 20 minutes. The highway widened and thinned, and the glow of downtown receded behind us. A soft smell of pine drifted in through the vents when I cracked the window, that resinous scent that means you're leaving the city's skin and stepping toward its raw edges. Finally, he spoke. "You ever think about how fragile time is?" he asked, as though the question belonged in casual conversation. That I gave a half-laugh, cautious. "I think about fragile things all the time, cars, bones, paychecks. Time? Not so much." He didn't smile. "I'm not from here. Not from now, I mean." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I've had passengers claim many things. Actors with credits that didn't exist, prophets selling leaflets, drifters with stories that bent reality at its joints. But something in his voice anchored me. It wasn't wild, it wasn't boastful. It was calm, measured, like he was reciting the truth of gravity. "You're saying you're from the future?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Yes." He leaned forward slightly, enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against the back of my seat. "I came back because something happens here. Tonight. I need to be there. And I need you to take me as far as the road will allow." The silence that followed was heavy. The rain thickened, drumming against the roof. I thought about pulling over, telling him the ride was over, leaving him by the roadside. But curiosity has always been my downfall. Instead, I nodded once and said, "All right, we'll see where it takes us." The highway spat us onto a smaller road that curved like a ribbon through the darkening woods. The rain softened again, thinning to droplets that pattered like fingers against leaves. The headlights carved out tunnels of gold through the trees, their trunks wet and black, slick with moss. The forest around Stone Mountain has its own pulse. Hickories and oaks mixed with long-needle pines, the ground carpeted with damp leaves that smell like smoke and soil when crushed. Even through the closed car, I could sense that earthy perfume rising. When we reached the park, the official lots were empty, gates pulled half-closed. I eased the cab along a narrow service road, its edges soft with mud. The man in the back told me to keep going until the tires couldn't find purchase anymore. Finally, the path narrowed to nothing but a strip of gravel and I stopped. "This is as far as I go," I said. He nodded, as though he'd known all along. Then he surprised me. "Come with me, just for a while. You'll understand." Every instinct told me no. But another part, the one that always wanted to see what lay behind the curtain, whispered yes. I killed the engine. The forest sighed around us, filled with the whisper of rain through branches, the steady drone of cicadas waking early for the night. We stepped out, and the air bit colder than I expected, sharp with wet stone and pine sap. My shoes sank slightly into the softened earth, and the tactile squelch grounded me in the present. Even as the stranger hinted at something beyond, we followed a faint trail, our flashlights sweeping across roots and puddles. Each step was deliberate, careful, slippery rocks, low branches clawing at sleeves. The smell of decomposing leaves rose stronger the deeper we walked, mingling with the metallic tang of wet granite. Somewhere off to the left, an owl hooted, its sound resonant and low. The stranger walked as though he knew the way, pausing only to glance at landmarks. An oddly bent pine, a boulder split cleanly in half, a trickle of water that gleamed silver in our beams. "These points don't change," he said softly. "Not in my time. The mountain stays, the forest shifts, but the anchors remain." We stopped when the trail opened into a clearing. The granite face of Stone Mountain loomed nearby, its bulk shadowed but unmistakable, a presence that filled the night. Rain tapped faintly against its surface, streaming down in rivulets. From where we stood, the city lights were a faint glow on the horizon, muted by mist. Here, it was only darkness, stone, and the restless breath of the woods. "What are we waiting for?" I asked. Keeping my voice steady, he crouched near the base of the stone, running his hand along its wet surface. "A convergence, a crack between what was and what will be. It happens tonight, for a few minutes only." I tried to laugh, but the sound died in my throat. The forest was too silent now. Even the cicadas seemed to have withdrawn. My pulse thrummed in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe slow, steady. Safety strategy, I told myself. Stay calm, stay alert, know your exits. Behind us lay the trail, marked by the bent pine, the boulder, the stream. I repeated those points in my head like lifelines. A rustle broke the silence. I swung my beam toward the sound. 2 deer stood at the edge of the clearing, their bodies taut with stillness, eyes reflecting like molten coins. They watched us, ears twitching, then bounded away without a sound, disappearing into the black. The stranger smiled faintly. They sense it too. We waited. The minutes stretched, punctuated only by rain dripping from branches, the distant groan of thunder rolling miles away. I shifted my weight from foot to foot, feeling the damp cold seep into my shoes. The stranger placed his palm flat against the rock, closed his eyes, and whispered something I couldn't catch. Then it happened. A low vibration, so subtle at first I thought it was my heartbeat, rippled through the ground. The stone before us shimmered faintly, not with light but with the suggestion of movement, as if reality itself had gone fluid. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but the shimmer remained. It was like watching heat rise from asphalt on a summer day, but denser, deeper. The air thickened, carrying a metallic scent, sharp and electric. My skin prickled, every hair on my arms standing erect. The stranger turned to me, his face pale in the beam of the flashlight. "This is it. Do you understand now?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The vibration grew, a hum that filled my chest. The forest seemed to lean inward, every tree pressing close to witness. I wanted to run, yet my legs held me fast, rooted like the oaks around us. And then, as quickly as it came, it began to fade. The shimmer wavered, the hum thinned, and the air lightened. The stone became stone again, nothing more. The cicadas returned, their chorus swelling as though the world had exhaled. The stranger dropped his hand, his shoulders sagging. He looked older in that moment, drained. "It wasn't enough," he murmured. "Not this time." I found my voice. "What was that?" He met my gaze. "A doorway, not fully open, but it will be. Someday." We stood in silence, the rain softening into mist once more. My instincts urged me to lead us back before the trail grew too dark, before we lost the markers that guided us. I tapped his shoulder, gestured toward the bent pine. Step by step, we retraced our path. The boulder, the stream, the faint glisten of the service road ahead. The forest seemed less ominous now, almost protective, as though it had watched us survive a test. When we reached the cab, the stranger paused with his hand on the door. "You'll remember this," he said. "When the time comes, you'll understand more than you do now." He climbed inside, gave me a new address back toward the city, and we drove in silence. By the time I dropped him off near a darkened office building downtown, the rain had stopped, and the sky had cleared enough for a sliver of moonlight. He stepped out without another word, vanished into the shadows, and I never saw him again. That I sat in my cab for a long time before turning the meter off. The city had returned to its rhythm, horns blaring, headlights cutting through intersections, the smell of fried food drifting from late-night diners. Yet I carried the forest with me still, the scent of pine and stone, the shimmer that defied explanation. In the years since, I've thought often about that night, about the fragility of time, the way a single moment can stretch and reshape everything you thought you knew. Maybe he was truly from the future. Maybe my mind played tricks in the tension of darkness and rain. But one truth remains. The world holds more than we see from the safety of the streets. In the quiet of the woods, in the echo of stone, there are cracks through which mystery seeps, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky enough to be there, you catch a glimpse of it. A reminder that time, like the forest, is alive, breathing, shifting, and waiting to be discovered. I still drive at night, and sometimes when I pass near Stone Mountain, I roll down the window. I breathe in the damp air, listen for the owl's call, and wonder if somewhere ahead, just beyond sight, the doorway waits again. The first thing I noticed that morning was the light. It was later than I usually slept, the sun already lifting above the jagged edges of Los Angeles buildings, washing everything in that pale, dusty gold the city only seems to have in late summer. I had spent half the night wandering alleys with my spray cans, sketching in notebooks, watching walls transform under my hands. By the time I finally collapsed into bed, the air outside had already shifted into dawn, cool and sharp, carrying the smell of asphalt and damp earth from the sprinkler mist. I don't know why I woke when I did, but something felt wrong or different, like the city was holding its breath. I pulled on my sneakers, paint still flecked across their toes, and stepped out into the narrow street where the walls I'd painted for years stood like familiar guardians. The air was dry but heavy, laced with smog and the faint sweetness of blooming jacaranda that somehow clung on this late in the season. Cars hissed past, tires whispering over uneven pavement, and somewhere overhead a crow called, sharp and resonant. Before winging off toward the palm-lined horizon, I walked with purpose, yet slowly, scanning the murals that lined the block. Some were mine, some belonged to others, layered histories of color and line. But it wasn't until I turned the corner and faced the wall I had painted only 2 nights before that my heart began to stutter in my chest. The mural had changed. What I had left there was a sprawling piece, abstract swirls of cobalt and crimson, intersecting arcs that represented the city's chaos and rhythm. It was unfinished, too. I had planned to add the final highlights that would pull the whole design together. But what I saw now was something else entirely. The shapes had twisted, deepened, sharpened into forms I had never laid down. Where I'd left a suggestion of movement, there was now clarity. Faces emerging from the paint, eyes too lifelike, watching. A figure stretched across the wall, cloaked and faceless, its hands spread as if reaching for anyone who passed. The paint was mine. The colors, the layering. It was undeniably my style, but not my intent. Every curve had shifted into something darker, more deliberate. My fingertips brushed the surface of the wall. The texture was the same, grainy stucco catching on my skin. No fresh drips, no tacky patches. It was dry, as though it had been here for years. That I stepped back, my sneakers crunching on grit. My mind buzzed with questions. Had someone copied my work, altered it overnight? But how could they mimic the layering, the blending I'd only just laid down? No smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, nothing to suggest activity in the last 12 hours. That I scanned the street for witnesses. An old man pushing a cart of recyclables passed slowly, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. A jogger rounded the corner, earbuds in, sweat streaking his temple, not even glancing at the wall. Life went on around me, unbothered, while my creation stared back at me with eyes that had not been there when I'd walked away. I circled the block, searching alleys, peering behind dumpsters, looking for evidence. Discarded cans, paint caps, anything. The alleys smelled of damp cardboard, fried food grease wafting from distant kitchens, and the ammonia tang of urine. Rats scuttled in shadows, claws clicking softly against concrete, but nothing else moved. No evidence of another artist. I returned to the mural and stood rooted. The longer I looked, the more the details seemed to shift. Not in broad strokes, but subtle movements, like shadows rearranging. The eyes seemed to follow, the lines pulsing faintly as though alive. I shook my head hard, trying to ground myself. I dug my nails into my palm, felt the sting, reminded myself that fear sharpens illusions. But curiosity won. I decided to get closer, tracing the lines of the figure. My fingers skimmed the edges of a painted hand, its outline somehow colder than the wall around it, though the sun had already warmed the stucco. My breath slowed, each inhale deep with the dust of the street and faint chemical remnants of paint long dried. My instincts told me to leave, to walk away and let this mystery lie, but something in me, something that had always driven me to paint walls in the dead of night, urged me forward. So I followed the mural's edges. The trail of color bled from the main figure into smaller details along the wall. A series of paths, drawn like roots, stretching toward the alley that ran behind the building. My pulse quickened. It looked like a map, though I hadn't painted one. Each root-like streak curved and bent until it disappeared into the shadow of the alley. I stepped carefully into the narrow space. The air was cooler here, heavy with mildew and trash. The ground was slick in patches, water dripping steadily from a broken pipe overhead. Graffiti tags lined the walls, some familiar, others foreign. But none bore the uncanny life of the mural I'd left. A cat yowled from somewhere above, then landed softly on a dumpster lid, its eyes glowing green in the dimness before it darted away. I traced the painted roots with my eyes, though in the alley they appeared to thin, fading almost entirely. I squatted low, pressing my palm to the wall where the last streak ended. The surface here was damp, moss pushing through cracks. For a long moment I stayed there, listening. The city's noise muted in the alley, replaced by smaller sounds. The drip-drip of water, the scuttle of insects, the distant hum of traffic like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Then I heard it. A faint scratching, from deeper in the alley. Not rat scurrying, this was more deliberate, rhythmic, like something clawing or etching. My breath caught, but I forced myself to step forward, one shoe at a time, soles sticking slightly to the damp ground. I turned off the flashlight app on my phone. Instead, I let my eyes adjust to the shadow. My father always taught me to keep light low in uncertain places. Less chance of blinding yourself, more chance of spotting motion. I eased forward until the sound stopped. Silence. My ears strained, catching only the flutter of wings as a pigeon burst from a ledge, scattering dust. I steadied myself with one hand on the wall, its cool, rough surface an anchor. And then, at the end of the alley, I saw another mural. It wasn't one of mine. It was small, hidden, a figure crouched low, drawn in darker tones. Charcoal blacks, sickly greens. The style was close to mine, close enough that it could have been mistaken, but the lines were sharper, less forgiving. The figure's face was obscured, but its hand stretched outward, palm open, reaching. My stomach dropped. It was reaching in the same direction as the figure on my wall outside. I froze. The air thickened, my chest heavy with it. The smell here was different, too. Less mildew, more metallic, almost like blood or iron. I took a step back, then another, my instincts screaming retreat. The mural remained motionless, just paint on brick, but the weight of its presence pressed on me. When I finally returned to the main street, the sun was higher, traffic thicker, horns blaring, the city alive again. The mural I had painted stood as it had been, changed, watching but silent. My hands shook as I pulled a notebook from my bag and began sketching every detail. I needed to record it, to anchor it in memory, to convince myself it was real. That night I returned. The city was different after dark. The air cooled, the smells sharpened, exhaust, street food, trash. Crickets sang in patches of weeds pushing through cracks, and somewhere, a coyote barked from the hills. I moved carefully, sticking to lit paths, always scanning for movement. My mural looked the same as in the morning, though under the streetlight its eyes gleamed more vividly. The painted roots still pointed toward the alley. I carried more than just my sketchbook this time. I carried a small flashlight, water, and a rag soaked in solvent. My plan was to test it, see if the changes were truly paint or something else. But when I pressed the rag to the wall and rubbed, nothing came off. The colors remained, vibrant and whole. My chest tightened with the realization. This wasn't something I could erase. I stepped back, my shadow long against the wall. Movement flickered in the corner of my vision, and when I turned, I saw it. The mural figure's hand had shifted, angled slightly more toward me than before. My breath stilled, my body frozen. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for it to move again. Eventually, the night air grew colder, and my body reminded me I was still flesh and bone. I left, heart hammering, and didn't sleep until the sky began to lighten again. Days passed, and I returned again and again. Each time, something was different. The shadows deeper, the eyes sharper, the painted roots longer. Once, I found fresh claw marks on the alley wall, gouged deep, though no sound of tools or intruders had ever reached me. Once, a stray dog followed me halfway there, then stopped abruptly, whining. Refusing to step closer to the alley, I began keeping records. Sketches, photographs, even audio recordings of the sounds I heard. When I showed them to others, most shrugged, said I was imagining things, that murals always shift with light, with weather. But I knew what I saw. The last time I went, the mural's face had changed. Where once it had been faceless, now it bore features. My own, twisted, eyes hollow. I stood trembling, unable to breathe. It was then I understood. This was no ordinary art. It was a mirror, or a doorway, or both. I haven't painted since I walk past walls now without cans in my bag, without color on my hands. I still smell the paint sometimes, sharp and sweet, lingering on warm nights, and I wonder if the figure still waits in that alley, reaching. The lesson I carry is this: creation has power, more than we often realize. A wall is never just a wall. Sometimes, when you paint, you open something. And sometimes, when you wake, what you opened looks back at you. And you can never be sure if it will stop.